When I was 19 years old and just finished my sophomore year in college, I had the wonderful opportunity to participate in the East Asia Study Program that my college in Santa Barbara and another college in the Midwest offered together. And so I spent the entire summer living in and traveling throughout East Asia. We spent the first 4 weeks in Taichung in the country of Taiwan, and then the next week after that, we were up in Taipei in the northern part of the island. And then from there, we flew over to Hong Kong and Macau, across the South China Sea and up into Guangzhou, China. And from there, we flew to Korea and spent time in Seoul, where I was able to go up to Panmunjom in the demilitarized zone that is often in the news these days. And then finally ended up in Japan, where we flew into Osaka and then into Tokyo. And finally, when we were all done, we landed in Honolulu to decompress and think about all the things that we had learned and experienced. In each country that we went to, we studied history, politics, religion, art, and culture. And we not only read about all of those things in those particular places, but we went to places of those things, like government offices and schools and museums and temples and shrines. And in many of the places where we went, there were people who worked there that gave us lectures. So this was such an experiential trip that it just seemed like every day I was living something that I had just read about in the books that I was reading. To say that this particular experience was life-changing would not be an exaggeration. One of the things that stood out as perhaps the highlight of the entire trip for me was one of my last nights in Taipei, in the country of Taiwan. Somebody had told me about this area downtown that was just packed with people. It was a shopping area, but not the high-end shopping where the tourists went. This is the shopping area where the local people went. Somebody said, if you want to get a feel for what Taipei is really like, you got to go there. So there were several dozen of us on this trip together, and we're all staying at this place in Taipei. And I asked everybody, does anybody want to go with me? Nobody wanted to go. So I thought, well, I know how to take a taxi somewhere. It's not that far. I've got the address of the place I want to get back to where we're staying. I've got money in my pocket. We're going to be just fine, me and the taxi driver. So anyway, I got to this place, and it was before the sun went down, but I stayed there for hours because it was such an amazing place. I had never seen so many people shopping at once. And these were people out buying their goods for dinner that evening and people buying things that they needed during the week. And it was so crowded, it was hard to walk around. On the street level, every sidewalk was packed, and the street was packed as well. And then up above every level of sidewalks was another sidewalk. It was built with wood, and people would walk along those storefronts, and there would often be tables and little booths set out in front of those. And then up above that, there was another level. It was like 3 or 4 levels of sidewalks. And to keep people from having to walk all the way down 3 or 4 levels and then crossing the street and walking all the way up, there were like these catwalks that went back and forth, connecting them all. And every single place I looked, there were hundreds of people. In fact, when I added up probably in my head about how many people I was looking at, there were thousands upon thousands upon thousands. I couldn't even keep track. And I remember thinking, this is amazing. There are so many people here. And for some reason, I remember feeling God's presence. God being with me, God being with all these busy shoppers and the shopkeepers. I just felt that God was there in the midst of that. When I got back to where all the other students were staying, I was telling them what it was like, and they were looking at me like, why would that be interesting? But to me, there was something special about being where the people are that live there and getting away from what the government authorities are telling us that people live like, and the religious authorities, and staying in the hotels and the places where we stayed. I wanted to see the people for myself. And so I was explaining to them what it was like, and one of them said, "It's too bad that all those people are going to hell, isn't it?" And I remember saying, what do you mean? And they said, "Well, we know that they're not Christians, and as Christians we believe that we're the only ones who are saved. Everybody else goes to hell." And, other people chimed in and said, "Yeah, gee, that's too bad. These people are going to be tormented eternally as more than you can ever imagine because they don't believe what we believe about God." And I remember just thinking, I don't believe that. And they looked at me like I had two heads. And I thought, I'm not sure I belong here. I might want to go back to where I was, where all those people were walking around and shopping. But it was that moment when I thought, I want to know what truth is for me. I knew what truth was that I was told in church and in Sunday school, and I knew what truth was for all these people that were told what to believe, but I thought, I want to know what it is in here that I really believe and why. And it was almost like one of those lightning bolt conversion experiences, but it wasn't my salvation, it was my major. Suddenly I realized I'm going to major in philosophy. And I thought, oh my gosh, I never expected that. But as I was thinking about the intro to philosophy course that I had had and another philosophy course in my first 2 years of college, I remember thinking there are classes that I can take that will help me with this. Classes like epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge, ontology, the theory of being, ethics, philosophy of religion, and of course, logic. What makes an argument logical or a thought process? When I got back to campus, about a week after I returned from the trip, I declared my major. And the next 2 years were just a fascinating time for me to take in all the things that people have been saying about truth and knowledge for thousands of years. Stuff I'd never thought of, or many of it I've never even heard about before. In this morning's passage that Kaylee just read to us, Pontius Pilate, when Jesus was arrested, asked Jesus the question, what is truth? That's the question that I was asking as I was traveling around East Asia. And I'm pretty sure that's a question that each and every one of us has asked at some point and maybe are asking right now. Whenever we look at a passage in the Bible, it's important to look at the context. Last week, I kind of walked you through how to look at the words right before what we're reading and the words right after. Today, I want to show the importance of looking at the entire text. In other words, for today, the entire Gospel of John. This is not going to take nearly as long as it sounds, just so you know. So, in the Gospel of John, the word truth and the word true come up 43 times. That's a lot. That's more than, on average, twice for every chapter. And some chapters, truth is just loaded in those chapters. Now, in comparison, the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, truth is mentioned in there 6 times. And I think the word true maybe once. So there's 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and they're called the synoptics because synoptic means seeing similarly or seeing all together. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic Gospels simply because they see Jesus and his life so similarly. And then John is seen kind of like the gospel all on its own that's really different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So in the 3 Gospels that we call the synoptic Gospels, truth is mentioned 6 times. In all of them put together. So we know that this idea of truth is really, really important So the gospel writer, John. And in order to understand all of his gospel, it's important to realize what John must have meant by the word truth and the concept truth. Another thing I just want to share with you in juxtaposition of the synoptics and John, in the synoptic gospels, the word kingdom comes up about 120 times. In John's gospel, I found it once. So it's important to realize that when Matthew and Mark and Luke are talking about Jesus, they're really talking about Jesus as a new kind of king in a new kind of kingdom. And even though we don't have a lot of kings and queens in the world today, back then, that was a way of saying, this is what it's like for everyone, and this is how Jesus is different. So that's the synoptics. In John, what we're looking at today, the overriding theme, or one of the most important overriding themes, is truth. How do we know what's true? Now, I also want to tell you another word that comes up over and over and over again in John's gospel, even more than truth, is the word life. And in order to understand what truth means, we have to know what truth has to do with life, with our day-to-day living, because John talks about truth and life and truth and life and truth and life and truth and life over and over and over. And so when John talks about Jesus being truth and Jesus bringing truth, we have to know that a way of understanding truth has to do with our day-to-day living. It has to do with my life and with your life. And then to get down a little bit to the nuts and bolts, if you read all of John, and I recommend it, you can do this in one sitting if you like. It's not really that long. And you just look at those two words, truth and life. We know that truth for John, because this was important to Jesus, who he was writing about, has to do with our faithfulness. Our faithfulness as followers of Jesus to a relationship. So truth isn't just a matter of facts that we keep up here. To Jesus, and therefore to John, truth has to do with how we relate to other people. And one of the most famous, often quoted scriptures from John about truth is when Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And what many people do is they say, aha, so there you have it. Jesus just said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one gets to God except through Jesus. So people will say, therefore you have to be a Christian. Everybody else goes to hell. But when you look at the context there, Jesus is just telling his disciples, it's time for me to go. I'm going to be with God now. I'm leaving all of you. And frankly, they're starting to freak out. We've always been following you, Jesus, because you've been here and you've been showing us the way. You've been showing us truth and living it out. We don't know what to do when you're gone. And so Thomas, who is sometimes known as the doubting apostle or the doubting disciple, says to Jesus, well, how can we know the way? We don't even know where you're going. And so you get this idea that the disciples are just in grief. They're losing their best friend, their mentor. He's just told them, I'm going to be gone. And they're trying to figure out, how are we going to know the way when you're not here with us? And Jesus, I think very calmly, probably said this. Well, he did say it, but probably calmly, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So the question wasn't, Jesus, tell us about all the other religions in the world. Are we the only ones that are going to make it? The question was, what are we going to do to find the way when you're gone, when you've left us? And basically what Jesus was saying, look at who I've been when I've been with you for these last few years. Look at what I've taught you. Look at who I've been as a person. Look at how I've been living my life and how I've been relating to you. That's how you'll know the way. And I don't know about you, but I find great comfort in that, because there are times in my life where I just think, oh my gosh, where am I supposed to go? Where's the way? What am I supposed to do? And I can remind myself to look to Jesus, who he was, what he taught, who he was being in relationship with other people. The second thing, in terms of understanding Jesus is the truth, is being true had to do with being faithful to your essence. In other words, who you are in here. Being faithful. So, in the Gospel of John, Jesus constantly spoke in metaphorical terms. And of course, a metaphor is just when you compare one thing to something else in order to understand the deeper essence of that thing. And so Jesus was the thing, and he said things all the time metaphorically. I am the bread of life. I am the bread who came down from heaven. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the gate for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am. Jesus was constantly trying to help people understand what his essence was through metaphors. And of course, sometimes people will say, aha, Jesus said, I am the way, therefore everyone else is wrong, every other religion's wrong, etc., etc. But my question is, if Jesus used all these metaphors, is Jesus a gate for the sheep? I mean, literally? Come on now. But the idea is Jesus constantly talked about who he was because he had a really good idea of his essence, and that's how he lived. For me, I think, wow, what a good example. How can I live from my essence? I often wonder, what would it be like if we constantly read the Bible ontologically? So I said earlier, ontology has to do with being. I grew up in a church where the Bible had to do with a bunch of rules, and you follow all those rules, do all the things we tell you to do, and you make it. And as I read the Gospel of John, I see an entirely different way of being faithful to God. You see, you can follow all the rules and still not have any love in your heart. You can follow every single rule and have no compassion or kindness for other people. You can follow all the rules and be absolutely miserable. But that's not who Jesus was in his essence. He was alive, he was joyful, he related to people with compassion and kindness, and constantly said things like, it all boils down to this, how we love God and love one another all around us. In this day where we hear things in the news like alternative facts, and we listen to people saying things that we know are just untrue, far from the truth, let us remember the words of Jesus. Let us remember to be faithful to who we are and to who other people are. People we relate to and people we don't relate to at all. Let us allow them to be who they are being, because you know what? It is about essence. It's about letting people be who they are and being faithful to who you are and to who they are and relating in such a way. God, through Jesus, was constantly telling us, all these years later, be faithful to who you are. Be faithful to your relationships to one another. Be faithful to your relationship with God and in the world. I really believe that that's what it means to live truthfully, and I wonder if Jesus had all that in mind when he said earlier in John's Gospel, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Amen.